Welcome to the Veritas Automata Deep Dive. I'm Ben Savage, the CEO of Veritas Automata. I have Sarkar with me. We're going to talk today about deep research tools. We've been testing the ones on the web and some local ones with some interesting results, shall we say.
True, yeah. I spend nearly half of my day on the local one, had interesting exploration around with, but it's truly an interesting tool, don't you think?
Well, and I think particularly for those of us who either go through a lot of white papers or trying to figure out how to do new things, it's a way to get a lot of information fast. As we've seen, you got to be a little careful if you trust it. And then just like you ran into issues getting the local model running, we did see some of the big tools fail as well.
True. I mean, you are going beyond the realm of LLM memory to exploring the web in real time, scraping the data, and you're with anybody who has scraped the web understands that there is a lot of noise in there, right? They could have pop-up advertisement, things like that. You still have to navigate through all of that and still extract something meaningful to get to an answer. And
writing a research report or an analyst report is an art, right? You have to go through experience and do that. And everyone's got their own way to do it with differing levels. And we kind of see that from some of the tools, that there are some different approaches in the way they bring it up.
Yeah. So one thing you might notice as you use those tools, some of the tools comes back and ask you some additional question. After doing a quick research, it's interesting how they set it up. It's like if you ask a question, it probably goes out into its memory bank before even exploring and tries to narrow down which line of research, because research truly is going down a rabbit hole rather kind of spreading it thin, right? So it kind of tries to understand which rabbit holes you want to go down to.
So we're going to pull up the first of those deep research tools, which we used, which was Perplexities. Right. So let me add that to the screen here, add that to the stage, and here we go. So this is what we got when we entered the prompt into Perplexity. And we're doing some research on robots. So this is testing deep research tools, but also something new you'll see us adding as the year goes on, as we continue to find what the right platform is for the R&D that we need to do.
Yeah.
And Perplexity was interesting, right? That was when we gave it the prompt and it just ran with it. It didn't ask us any questions. It probably was the fastest of all of them.
Right.
And as we went through, it had good detail. Let me switch screens here real quick. There we go. It had good detail, but some of what we saw as we were looking through, we could see where it didn't capture some of the stuff that might have been important to someone who's going to use these platforms. It was interesting, and this is not a knock against the way Perplexity did it, is that all of these tools we know is prioritize different information. So like it spent a lot of time talking about like the processor capability and the development capability, but it didn't talk as much about the sensor packages on it as some of the others did.
And which could be important for, especially a robot, which would be in a perception-based environment, right? So,
well, and to be clear, we gave it a fairly broad prompt, right? Yes. So we weren't saying focus just on the sensors. Right. We were asking it two things. It's like, let's talk about the robots and let's talk about some of the development capabilities.
Right.
But Perplexity was the one actually that we didn't have to go give clarification on the manufacturer or the models for both. It was able to just figure out.
Pull it out, yeah.
But if we switch to ChatGPT, and I'm just making sure it's on the right screen. There we go. Here we can see, we put the initial question. It asks us some clarifying questions, which I actually kind of like when it does these, where it shows you what its thought process is going to be. So then as we go through, it's asking us which model, it's asking us who makes Tron, and what are we particularly interested in. So there we can add some clarifying information, right? We can say, here are the two specific models we're looking at, and here are some of the things that we're interested in learning more about. And then as we go through, I think you have a point, Saurabh, that this model, this report does give us a table, but it's at the end, and you would have preferred that as the way you like to look at data at the beginning.
Yeah.
But some of the things that we saw as we went through, good description of the mobility and the functionality of them, but it really dove into the sensor suite between the two systems.
Yes. Yeah. Because these are truly not retail grade robots. You would use it for research or industrial purposes.
The go-to wireless is a little bit consumer grade. It's like right on that line.
Correct. Probably prosumer as all they call it, right? There's workstation grade in PC terms.
So if it's prosumer, is it amateur researcher? I'm not sure what the right term would be.
Yeah. But anyway, people who are interested in sensors and SDKs and not a Roomba user probably, right?
Yeah.
Maybe there is an overlap with Roomba users.
Though there is now a Roomba with an arm. It's not a Roomba. It's a competitive model. It has an arm. So it can pick things up out of its way.
Okay, that would be interesting. How it deals with cats in the way. I don't know. Cats, I'm not sure if you had a cat or not. They tend to be lazy and they hate robots.
We had cats growing up, and I can see now, if your kids have watched Star Wars, there's the scenes of R2-D2 with the little, when it gets aggravated at people, it's got a little taser built in. You probably don't want that in your Roomba. Your kids might find out that. But it does a good job of, ChatGPT does a good job of going through. And as you point out, this is only using Mini, right? We didn't use the 4.0.
Right.
But it does a good job of breaking everything out and getting you the information on where you would go. One of the things I do like is that they tend to do their references inline versus all at the end that some of the other ones do. And then, as we were talking, it did a nice job of breaking out the programming pieces.
Because I was interested to see if it is a ROS compliant or, those things which kind of we think about day to day.
Well, and what are all the tools? Because back to our conversation about R2-D2 and the taser, we're going to push the performance of whatever robot we get.
Correct, yeah.
So as we keep going down, the target use cases, which is something that the Perplexity model didn't mention anything about.
Yeah.
And then we get here to the key specifications. And let's be clear, if you look up these robots, they are kind of apples and oranges, but from our research perspective, they're not. One is a quadruped, one is bipedal. But Limex Tron did do a really cool video. I think it's the one I sent you, where they're going with their wheeled feet attachment. They're going upstairs with an arm.
That was
pretty impressive.
Cool. Yes.
So it does a nice job of breaking all the connectivity out. So we're now going to go to Gemini, we tried this, and we ran all these at roughly the same time. And to our point about the deer flow, sometimes you can ask the model a question it can't really answer. And we kind of got to piece out, man, this is complicated here. We did rerun it, so we'll check in and see how that's running. And it did give us an answer the second time.
Okay.
So at least the second time it redeemed itself. But the first time we ran it, it went,
it gave up.
Which we've all done at some points when you're researching, and you gotta go back and start over and rethink.
Right.
So here we're looking at this cold, by the way. So we didn't pre-read this one because it just finished, because we had to redo it. And here they're doing a pretty deep dive. Nice job on breaking out the difference in the way they work.
Yeah.
They've got their table or much earlier here, so not to the end.
Yeah.
And this probably makes more sense than the way ChatGPT did it, because here it talks about the way the mobility works, the legs versus by 2 versus 4, but it does a good job now of getting into the technical information so you can know how much more you want to go into. And this is focused very much on the way they navigate. That's interesting. Okay, power systems.
Onboard computing.
I like this approach better because the other two kind of broke these out into paragraphs, and this is probably important.
It's easy to consume knowledge that way. So,
well, and particularly for some of the stuff that we're looking at, we need to know how far can we really push this, and what can we do from a sensing and a programming perspective. And these are going to be driving decisions. The way it handles terrain is important, but not the absolute. Again, this is specific to our use case. So this is the cool thing about these tools. Each one is a little different.
I like how if you scroll up a little bit, they talk about ROS, and then in the table, towards the bottom of the table, I just noticed they have simulation platform, because we have been thinking quite heavily around those. They have NVIDIA Isaac.
There's what do they have for that, and then there's that new NVIDIA Isaac, which is what they're using for training like some of the new Star Wars stuff and for some of the other drone platforms out there. And I haven't looked into that. I would bet that's got to be an extension of Gazebo and some of that.
Correct. I am sure they're plugging into that ecosystem somewhere on the line.
So Gazebo is a simulation tool that's been around for a long time for ROS in particular.
Back when I was in grad school, so that tells you.
When we used it on some of those projects back in like 2018, we had those guys doing that.
Yes.
Who was that? Vecna? I think we worked.
Yeah, I think we worked on Vecna. Yeah.
Nice deep dive into the sensor suites.
Yeah. But it redeemed itself pretty well, I would say, for the second round.
And I would say I've done this a couple other times.
Yeah.
One of the other things that I like about Gemini in particular is it's really easy to put this into a Google Doc and then either share it or go work from there. Whereas ChatGPT asks you to share the chat, which is interesting, but it's not really how a lot of us work.
Right.
So now we're going to go and share, remove this one from stage, go to Okay, so this is the open source. This is Deerflow, which is out of ByteDance, correct?
ByteDance, correct, yeah.
And so first, talk a little bit about what you had to do to get this set up.
Yeah, so the repo is out there on GitHub as open source.
Yep.
You typically install it. The installation was fairly painless. But again, painless is a relative term. You need to know they were using UV, which is fairly new in terms of environment management for Python and all of that stuff. So anyway, so you get to install all that stuff and then configure it on env files, and so it's not a beginner friendly, I would call. You need to know some amount of Python, how to configure things and how to write those files, even though they had examples. Out of the box, it comes geared towards OpenAI or one of those cloud LLM, right? So to configure it back to Ollama, which is a local LLM that you can run on a server, I had to do some amount of research. The documentation they had wasn't appropriate. It wouldn't talk unless you put it /v1 underneath, which I had to find again. So there was some amount of discovery around it, which was fine. We go.
And I was asking you to do a harder problem than most people would, right?
Yeah.
Because part of what you and I have been looking at for the last almost 2 years now,
right?
How do you get some of these agents that you can run offline, just on your own data, not going to the public APIs if you don't want?
Correct. So, that involves that, so you dealing with power users when you are dealing with local LLMs and often. And it did use Trivali, which is basically for web search thing. So keep that in mind. If you're using it on a day-to-day basis, you have to pay for that piece of it. They have an option for DuckDuckGo SDK, but I haven't found that to be very good. So,
and that does highlight one of the challenges if you're trying to run this in your own environments is there are not a lot of good search APIs. There's a reason why most other search companies have not been successful compared to Google.
Correct. Yeah. So that's one of the issues is that with researcher, you are really searching the web, and that's where Google has dominated for a long time, right? Then you can see that in Gemini's answer, even it failed the first time, but second time it came around with a lot more dense information. Because they have the capability to navigate because they are a search engine to start with, right? So having set up all of that stuff, it started to fail because I was using local LLM, which was unreliable on how it was responding. So that was the key issue. So the LLM have to respond in a JSON format that the downstream stuff can use to generate additional questions, basically.
Which does hit an interesting point, right? There's a whole stream of ongoing research and work that there's a number of people doing about structured output from LLMs. And there's even some specific LLM models that you're supposed to kind of chain your responses to. So you use the main one, so you use DevStrol or you use DeepSeek or Qwen32, Qwen3 or something on your local, then you run it through the structuring LLM to get that structured JSON, because LLMs by themselves are not always good at that.
Correct. And that was the struggle. I ran it through multiple Qwen models, various different, 32B, 14B, 8B, quantized. Again, Ollama was quantized. Since we had massive amount of VRAM, I went up to precision 16, float 16.
You get to A6000s.
It still didn't do it. That was my pain point. I was like, maybe it's the quantization which is breaking the JSON structure or whatnot. Ultimately landed up, it was able to answer, don't get me wrong, it was able to answer things like, tell me why the sky is blue, which is kind of a straightforward. So it was able to answer that. But as soon as I put the prompt around, compare these two robots, it started failing pretty hard. So one time it did succeed, but it went in a completely different direction, how to install a ROS SDK, which was not my primary question.
And I've seen that even in the larger models, in the paid for tools, right? Where you're asking it to do a report and it will wander off halfway through and start answering a different question than you asked. Because either that's the data that's there or it thinks that it's there. I don't 100% know the reason because I haven't run the same thing enough to figure out what the pattern is. But I've definitely seen that where it's like, well, I'd much rather answer this question than the one you asked me.
The selective hearing, you're saying, like my kids do. Anyway, so ultimately, I settled on DevStrol, which is a Minstrel version for writing code, which was kind of surprising. Maybe because it succeeded, because since it's writing code, it understands JSON a lot better than other natural. Maybe that was the reason
That's a
behind
good point.
it.
It's also the newest of all those models.
Correct. Yes. So it was very very well. It performed every time. It didn't fail, and it returned answer. The one you see is kind of the output from the code itself. Pretty high level, I would say, compared to some.
And that's the other downside so far is there's not a good GUI for this tool, right? It's
Right.
you're telling me it's command line.
Well, there is a GUI they provided. I didn't go there because I'm a power user, so I'm like, all right, I'm gonna go everything on CLI. But yeah, they do provide a GUI, like a web interface, to do this, and probably you can export this out much easier. But again, at end of the day, it's the content of the research, right? So if you look through it, it did a pretty decent job on covering the sections very well, like sensor and all. It didn't go as detailed as Gemini or the OpenAI.
Well, and I think our conclusion is, as we were looking at it, that this probably ended up being more. It was more taken in by the sales pitch for the websites than the some of the deeper research. You could tell the other ones had found whether it was forums or other documentation in addition to the core website.
Yeah. Whereas if I looked at it through, they were not going like, more than a handful of references. Whereas if you look at Gemini, I think it's like 200 references, when Perplexity is around at least a couple of dozens around it. So again, it's probably limitation of the open source code at this point. I would kind of blame it. But the idea behind all of the tools is the planner, based on the question, how you're going to plan, what are the queries, and then kind of propagating that down the line.
Coming off camera.
Oh, all right. I didn't realize that. Okay. So yeah, probably it's worth digging and looking under the hood of Deerflow and kind of building something that tailored to it. Because end of the day, if you're doing some kind of research which needs to be proprietary and not exposed out, you might want to run it locally.
So that was the question I was going to ask: is what would your take be if we were to run Deerflow on a local, whether it's RAG or repository?
I think the research is a kind of a RAG, if you think about it. It's retrieving chunks from the internet.
So I guess to be more clear, like just local files, so no internet. So i.e. you go connect it up to a giant file share.
Yeah, I think it can be modified fairly with some amount of effort for sure, wherein the researcher asks certain more questions. Actually, the prototype we built for the RAG for the medical application, it does that. So you can ask what you want to ask, then it restructures the queries into multiple subqueries, and then pulls in information and then combines them together. So it's already done some of that. But if you were to run this kind of researcher, it would follow the similar path. But instead of running one-time restructuring of the requerying it would ask additional question based on what did it pull from the RAG, right? So why were the sales down in 2028? What's the reason behind it? Maybe that's a second level layer of questioning that can be brought in, right? Again, a lot of these tools have a limitation on how many times or how deep you can go based on LLM calls and stuff, or it could infinitely run and never return an answer, right?
And we've seen this with other agentic type issues, right? It's how does the agent know when to stop?
Right. Stopping is hard. So most of the time people apply that only you can go certain depth or certain number of calls, and that you got to stop and then combine the answer.
Is some of this also an issue of chat memory knowing between prompt to prompt what it was?
Part of it is, yes, because, as you are kind of putting, so agentic system, they have a common chat window, if you may call it. All of the agents are in there and they're talking and bringing more information, right? But each of the LLM also have a limited amount of context memory. So it's summarizing, or they have to summarize the chat window in itself, right? So one of the things we were talking earlier on offline was coding, right? If you can't push the entire repo of a Microsoft OS into the memory and expect it to certain things, because it won't be able to hold. First of all, even if it's able to hold, it doesn't know where to pay attention, right? So the RAG still going to be there even with this increasing million token LLMs, because it doesn't know where to put attention. The RAGs helps you put a spotlight on certain points, right? But the next generation is that when you get an answer, ask a set of questions to go deeper, and that would be more interesting, kind of like a graph RAG you have been referring to in the past, right? So, but traversing the graph of the knowledge as we are going deep into the retrieval process.
So I'm going to bring one more up, and we'll see what happened with it. Actually, maybe let me find the window. Here we go. Okay, it did not actually
Still thinking, I think.
But we'll bring it up anyway. So we were trying the Copilot researcher, right? So
Right.
for many of you who know that a lot of what Microsoft has built their Copilot stuff on has been the OpenAI, but Perplexity uses OpenAI and they use Claude and they use a number of those too. So that's why it's always interesting to run the same prompt on multiple tools, because the one thing that everyone has to realize when you're working at these, it's not just what is the model that you're using, it's what does the agent do? It's kind of back to what we were just talking about before, because the way that agent is structured and the way it dives into questions and the way it does stuff can give you a different result from the same model. And you see that from the Perplexity versus the OpenAI, and then you see the OpenAI versus the Google. And here you see the Microsoft. I'll see if I can zoom this in a little bit so that we can actually read what's going on. Let's go over here and see what we see. That's a little better, but still, I apologize for everyone who's trying to actually read this. But basically, we kind of had a failure with this one, it looks like. It didn't actually give us the nicely viewable summary, but we can go see all the thinking of what it did. And the one thing that caught my eye as we went through this is it did a lot of the same summarization that the others did, but it actually gives us a specific recommendation on why you would choose one of those, which none of the others did.
Yeah.
And we didn't ask it really to choose one or the other. We just said, give us a comparison. And I thought that was probably the most interesting piece out of this, and makes me want to rerun it to see if it gives me full results.
Yeah, I think with a lot of the LLMs, token cost going towards very, very small, maybe zero down the line. The moat or the IP would be around this pipelining of how different LLMs, the prompting and the engineering, right? So I think it kind of shows that all of them are using LLMs, but their preferences of showing certain things, going deep down, giving a final recommendation, or a summary table up on the document or bottom of the document. I think that flavor is going to be customized based on which tool you use.
It is, and you're already seeing differing go-to-market models of how these companies are trying to justify their subscription or their per token. Now, I don't think per token is going to go to zero, because so much of their revenue right now is, they're attempting to base it on per token, right? Whether it's they're going to charge you, what was the new Google thing is like $250 a month to be able to get access to VO3 and some of their newest models,
right? Versus
$20 a month for some others. But then when you look at API cost, you were telling me, I think, a while ago about a project you worked on where you very quickly burned through $20 or $100 of tokens.
Yeah.
Accidentally.
Yeah, but the reason I brought up the token going to zero is the open source model. They were lagging really behind. Yeah. Now they're catching up, right? So maybe it will move from a premium pricing model for the token to more of an infrastructure pricing model, which is again dirt cheap, right? But you are right that each of the LLMs will probably continue progressing. It's just which quality of LLM you want for different purposes, right?
Well, and also what is the model optimized for, right? That's where a lot of the DeepSeek's research breakthroughs, there was some breakthroughs on their training, but it was as much on the speed of inference and that they optimize their model for inference versus like fine tunability or other things.
Yeah.
And that might be okay for some use cases.
Sure, yeah. So, that's the interesting point you bring up around, how will if I think about the analogy over here, I like to do that, all the cars on the road there, they do the same purpose, right? But you have premium cars and then you have budget cars, right? Yeah. So maybe that's where the model's going to go. With premium, you get lots of bells and whistles and things like deep researcher, with maybe sometime, because right now there's probably no validation on what sources are, how authentic they are, is there a propaganda versus is it really an authoritative source?
It's the internet.
Well, that's true, but within the internet, you switch sources you're pulling from also varies. If it's a peer-reviewed kind of a write-up article, journal paper has a much higher score than something
from 4chan.
4chan or Reddit or keyboard warrior kind of an article, right? So maybe those will come into. It's more like, hey, how refined do you want your answers to be? Maybe that's the model the world will move towards slowly.
Well, and I think deep research tools are going to have a lot of value. I think one of the things that makes Deerflow interesting compared to the others is you can run that local. And that probably deserves some more experiments from us running it on local data sets to see how does it do there versus trying to have it go query the internet.
Right.
Because there are a lot of corporate applications for those where you want to keep your data offline. That's something we all have to be thinking about is, okay, It's not only where is the data and where can someone get access to it, but now when you're asking these questions, you've got to think about it like metadata, right? They may not be training on your data, but if they're training on the response or the question you ask, that can tell people a lot. Just like if you're not careful with your pictures and you don't remove the GPS tags, someone knows exactly where you are, even if you don't tell them where the picture was taken.
Correct. So I think the new trend you're referring to is agentic RAG, where they have basically it uses the same principle as a researcher. It's just that now you have it's pulling chunks from your repository, right? So one of the things we did early on was the RBAC, which is basically role-based access, right? The way I think about it is pulling books from a library, then you have this gated section of a library. Only if certain group of people are asking, agents have the permission to go in and fetch certain things from there. That could become interesting.
Well, there's a whole series of books, right? Where like going into the dangerous side of the libraries where they get all the interesting stories.
Right.
And it's not just Harry Potter. There's the magicians. There's a whole bunch of stories about that.
Yeah.
So, or now we can have AI agents trying to, I don't even want to think about it.
Yeah, because they are thinking, right? Now, how would that navigate with who is the key holder? Are they going to negotiate amongst each other that no, we need that for this purpose?
I didn't send it to you yet, but I found a whole thing where someone's got a version of diplomacy that AIs play, and they have to negotiate contracts with each other.
Oh man, okay, that's gonna be fun. Imagine an LLM being a DAN to another LLM who is a gatekeeper to that restricted part of library. That could be an interesting red teaming kind of an exercise to do it.
Sounds like we got to talk about red teaming in the next podcast.
Yeah, I think this is a very important topic, right? As we go deep and wild with the LLM, the security is going to be a major issue.
Cool. So, any last closing thoughts?
No, I think the deep research really advanced my ability to go find stuff real quick, right? So what helps is that it helps me free up from the grunt work and kind of focus on, creating more ideas or choosing the direction for research and things like that. So I think it's a really, really useful tool, but we just have to be careful which sources pulling data and validating.
Well, and that's the important thing, right? All of them have some ability to go see the sources that they're pulling from, and you have to go read through it. I was doing some research for a project where it was on a slightly esoteric sensor and what was the academic research around it, particularly around machine learning for a potential customer project. Right. And it's not a common sensor, and it did some good results. But I also knew I had to be very careful because from past experience, it doesn't find good stuff. It will make things up.
Yeah.
So you got to go, okay, here's the summary. And now I got to go read some of the white papers, but at least it put it all together in one place for me to go find it versus going through 50 pages of Google results and reviewing everything and making notes and all that.
Right. So it's hard, but I think it's evolving as it goes on, but it's going to stay there for a while for sure.
Cool. Well, we appreciate everyone joining us. Join us in 2 weeks and we'll be talking about red teaming and some of the considerations you've got to think about from security and LLMs. And we appreciate everyone for joining us.
Bye, everybody.